The economic hardships of the Great Depression drove people to discover brilliant ways to save money. Whether it was reinventing old tricks or coming up with shockingly clever ideas, they left no stone unturned and no cent unspent in their quest to survive and thrive. So, a big way that people ended up saving tons of money during the Great Depression was the concept of a victory garden. Basically, these are just tiny patches of land you use for cultivating and growing crops and vegetables in your backyard. The term victory garden comes from some wartime slang, but the gardens themselves were totally genius. It was getting very hard for Americans to shop for vegetables, especially since so many families were doing nothing but relying on basic crops to get by. Victory gardens gave all kinds of families an edge in the Depression because it let them grow a lot of different kinds of things for free. Not only did this mean that people had a source of food locked down, they also had a source of income. People could sell the things they grew in their gardens, or even rent the space out to others so that they could grow as well. Even the government was all for these gardens and regularly published resources that would help people understand how to grow and take care of one. It took a while before people were able to properly grow and maintain one, as no one's green thumb was really all that good, but eventually people got the hang of it and even retained the skill as a side hobby after things settled down. There was also this extreme focus on preserving food however it was possible to. Not just that, people really made the shift towards canned food as well. It didn't help that during the Depression, the production of canned food really took off too. It was always sort of popular, but it was never mass-produced like it was during this time. Nor were all kinds of basic necessities available in canned variants. Now you could have canned tomatoes, pineapples, ham, and all sorts of other basic pantry staples. The kind of stuff you would really need in your everyday cooking. People would preserve their stocks of supplies by using scraps too. Only the tiniest bits of ham were used for soups and meat dishes, and the difference was made up by using vegetables. People would use every part of the animal and not let a single thing go to waste. People would use fat drippings or the toes and tongue of an animal and all kinds of other things. They would learn how to cure meat, store items better, and reuse scraps of leftovers or repurpose them so that they could last just a day or two more. Remember how I said victory gardens were a good source of income? They weren't just that. These gardens helped for another reason, one unique to the Depression. This was the return of the bartering system. It became extremely common to barter for any kind of good or service since money didn't really have the same value, nor was it something people had, honestly. Whatever money they did have, they would save for official places like grocery marts and markets, where that was the only way they could buy things. Amongst each other, people started to barter. They would trade the things they grew in their victory gardens, and two of the easiest things to grow and really popular to trade were potatoes and tomatoes. They could go with just about anything, and all kinds of soups and stews used them. Then people would trade their hand-me-downs, basic kitchen tools, a shoelace, some soles, basically anything and everything that would mean you wouldn't have to waste money on repairs or buy something new when you could make what you have last just a bit longer. During the Depression, it was so common for people to struggle to the point that they would try to be resourceful in any way possible. This included making homemade cleaning products from things that were available and cheap. They used baking soda for things like scrubbing and polishing. Baking soda made for a wonderful surface cleaner, at least as wonderful as a makeshift one could be. When you mixed it with water, it worked to even help clean bathtubs and sinks. Others used white vinegar to clean glasses and any kind of glass surface. There was this brand of soap called Castile soap, which was honestly really good for what it was worth. It was this vegetable-based soap that got popular back then. On top of that, you had borax, which people used for cleaning. All of these things were easy enough to mimic at home. Did you know lemons didn't really have a lot of value as food during the Depression? That was because people would typically save any kind of lemon they had for its juice, which a lot of people used to get rid of odors and disinfect things. You'd honestly be surprised with the kinds of things people come up with in a crisis situation. Since meat was so hard to get thanks to all the rationing efforts and the fact that it was just expensive more than ever before, The way people would make meat last was by adding fillers to it. Things like oatmeal and breadcrumbs were used to stretch a meal out and make sure that it would involve only minimal meat. Most recipes would call for a lot more than what people were using, but that didn't cross their mind once. They were mostly just happy to be including meat at all. Any kind of broth, stew, or casserole, things that the American people are typically used to eating with protein in them, were stretched out using vegetables. Cabbages on the verge of wilting, tomatoes about to spoil, and as much potato as you can fit in one pot. It was things like these that helped people maintain their resources throughout the Depression. It was extremely important to be very intentional with your meat, because people had no other substitute for protein that was as good, but also because of its comfort. Meat was a way for people to restore their spirit and get their mood up, and that's why people would often save it either for celebrations or really bad periods. So, a way of repurposing things and adding fillers was using all kinds of leftovers. This was a pretty vital method of making your food supplies last longer. Those scraps had a lot of value in them because if you piled enough of them together, they definitely made more than a plate or two. Sometimes, you had enough going on in there to make an entirely new dish. People even made casseroles out of leftover scraps of ham, sausages, or beef, potatoes, and breadcrumbs. Faux food and mock food, like using mushrooms to imitate meat-based dishes and using leftover vegetables to add as a filling, were also really common. When people were done with a bird or animal, they would typically keep the bones because it was a great way to enrich your soup a little. That's the same way people began to get rid of stale bread and vegetables that were spoiling too. It was actually something that people theorized made their immune systems tougher. But I think that's just a folk myth. If anything, that would make your immune system more vulnerable, but you have to give credit where it's due. People were nothing if not resourceful during then. In the same way people would reuse their leftovers, people would cut trips to the doctor as much as they could. It was simple. A lot of the time, the doctor's advice just was not something you could apply in real life. They would tell you to give consultation fees, then ask you to buy 3 pills and syrups that you aren't even sure will work or not. Honestly, I don't think they're sure either. People would end up using things like chicken soup to cure colds, flu, and other kinds of basic issues. This is another reason why people really wanted to save their meat too. Instead of just wasting it on a day when you really miss the taste of chicken or beef, it was better to save it for when people in the household inevitably fell sick and need something like an actual beef stew. Lemons, when they couldn't be used for cleaning in the house, were used for things like sore throats and in place of cough syrup. The trick was to use lemon and mix it in with warm water and honey. This actually does work, so kudos to them. It's even believed by doctors to help relieve any discomfort in the throat. Lemon was used also because it had a lot of vitamin C in it, and that helped people boost the strength of their immune system. The less sick you got, the better it was for your funds. It wasn't just hard to pay the fees for the doctor, it was also really tough for people to support all the different kinds of bills. People would turn any kind of electrical appliance off as often as they could, cook with an open, natural fire when it was possible, and then they'd also try to save water as much as they were able to. This basically meant that people made a lot of use of rainwater. Whenever it would rain, especially in areas with really stormy weather, people would collect the rainwater that was left and leave barrels out to gather it. Then, they would try to purify it by straining it with a cloth so that any leftover mud or debris would go away. It was also boiled or filtered before people used it for drinking. In some places, it was pretty hard to get a tap or access to a well. Instead, people used lots of rainwater for washing their vegetables or cooking their rice. It was even used by people to help clean their dishes. This really helped a lot of people keep their water bill down, but it seems sad that they ever had to go through that. Yet another way people would stretch out supplies and make sure that any and all shopping trips were avoided: repurposing items, janky, rusted tools, break them down into cutters or glue them together and make it work. Use that shoe with a hole in it, the one that's missing a few laces too. Take a sack of feed and cut it. You can use the cloth. Don't let any thread, needle, or clip go to waste. Learn to sew, because it's going to save your life. Repurpose any kind of cloth you can find into skirts, sweaters, scarves, curtains, or Anything that means you don't have to spend more on unnecessary things. Any money people had was something they could only afford to spend on food, nothing else. Lots of families typically just lived off of hand-me-downs, especially ones with big sibling populations. The ones that didn't have those, it became common for families to move in with each other and survive the drought together. This meant that their wardrobes would get recycled too. Old furniture was another gold mine for resourceful families. Broken chairs were transformed into firewood or stripped for parts to repair other items. Even worn-out bedding found a second life. Mattresses were restuffed with anything soft, from old fabric scraps to straw. Glass jars were cleaned and reused to store everything from preserved foods to sewing supplies. Families also salvaged buttons, zippers, and patches from torn clothes to mend others, ensuring nothing was discarded if it had potential use. So, there's actually just a bit more to sewing than this initial analysis will tell you. Sewing became popular for lots of reasons, but the biggest two were probably the practical use of it and the fact that it let people vent. What do I mean by that? Times like the Depression are pretty much ideal scenarios and environments for growing an extremely frustrated population, and, well, not to make a silver lining where there really isn't one, but people like that make some pretty good art. They need creative outlets. They need places they can express themselves and ways they can unwind. Sewing managed to be that thing for a lot of people, and it helped because it meant that they could spend the time and keep the hunger at bay by distracting themselves with sewing. It helped save costs, make new clothes, and repair old ones. If you had a simple cut or two, instead of wasting time, gas, and money going to the clinic for a stitch, you'd just get someone in your family to sew it up. Sounds extreme? That was reality just 100 years ago. People learned a lot more skills than just learning to sew during the Depression. A lot of people also began their careers in amateur brewing. There were loads of reasons for this, some that you can probably imagine right away, and some that are pretty context-specific because they rely on things that happened right around the Depression. While some cider and a cold one were never really that expensive during the time the Depression was set, it was still a very unnecessary cost and something that people couldn't justify spending their money on. There was all kinds of unemployment, and there were also efforts from the government to ensure that substance abuse doesn't get any worse than it was. See, this was a terrible time for people to not be able to afford beer or make the space for it in their budget. Why? Two things. It was a time when people really needed beer, and it was also a time when people had just come fresh off of Prohibition, where they, exclusively learned how to ferment and make the stuff at home. Bootlegging distilled spirits became common, and moonshine became the next love of America. Was it illegal? Sure. Did it get you absolutely flat-out drunk? Absolutely. You really need a beer right at the end of a typical day in the house too, because cooking from scratch all day really takes it out of you. It was hard for people to really get any kind of pre-packaged food. While it was available, it wasn't something people could justify spending their money on because the sum of the inexpensive stuff in your pantry was less than the pre-packaged food. If you were making something from scratch, it also meant that you rarely had to spend a lot of money hunting for ingredients too. Any kind of sugar, rice, and beans were something that people still had lying around, and it was a lot easier to make something out of that than waste money trying to get ready-made food. Then, there was the whole nutrition thing. People really didn't want to get sicker, and they also knew they weren't in a place where they could really afford prime nutrition either. Cooking from scratch was healthier, and it often gave families the key things they were missing from their diets, so lots of people preferred to do it that way. So if you might recall, then just a while back I mentioned how people started to move in together because it helped to survive together. Well, that spirit, or that entire mindset, actually spread way past just people's immediate or extended families. People began to share all kinds of things with their neighbors, and it was a big way to live during the entire Depression. You just couldn't cut it alone, and the ones that tried learned pretty soon that it really helped to keep ties with people. You could help share resources. Whatever you had that another house didn't could end up helping them. You had plenty of reason to help them too, because it simply wasn't possible that you wouldn't end up in a tough spot soon too. People wanted good ties with those around them because they could help them out of sticky situations like that. There were even things like communal dinners, Entire neighborhoods would get together and arrange feasts for every home on the block. People could make a lot more food when they were pooling everything they had together to cook one big meal for everyone, as opposed to lots of tiny meals and individual servings throughout the day. It was a lot easier to use wooden stoves too. The availability of fuel was always something that was up in the air. Even the people that were rich enough to have fancy stoves would switch to coal-based ones or ones that used firewood. It was a lot cheaper, and in rural areas this was pretty much entirely the norm, really. It helped to be self-sufficient and provide a steady source of fuel, and more importantly, of fire. In the winters, it was really hard to spare the expenses for heaters and other ways to warm yourself up. Wooden stoves also doubled as lifesavers for making do with limited resources. Families would gather fallen branches, chop wood, or even burn old furniture for fuel. Coal, when affordable, became a go-to substitute, but many relied on foraging for firewood in nearby forests. These stoves weren't just for cooking. They became the heart of the home during winter, where families huddled around them to stay warm. Cleverly placing pots and pans on the stove maximized the heat's reach, warming up rooms and stretching fuel to last longer. It wasn't like the American people, who were facing a pretty serious patch of unemployment, could pay for insulation or central heating either. These are the same people who couldn't manage to pay for the fuel they needed to cook every day. Why do you think they're using these stoves in the first place? It wasn't always bad, though. They could give the heat an entire house would need, and they would also make the food taste better too. In pretty much the exact same way, you must be familiar with all the kinds of things people are doing to save costs by making repairs at home now. Not just things like stitching yourself up or sewing your own clothes and patching the odd hole or two. People would even reuse buttons and zippers or make use of furniture that was clearly long past its life. People would reupholster it so that it would last longer. It was common for drapes and sofas to really suffer some wear and tear throughout their stay at most people's homes. People learned to use staple guns and glue. They learned their way around a hammer. And they learned how to repair things like irons and radios too. Take apart one with a screwdriver, get the soldering iron out, and get to work. Honestly, your average Joe became something of a smith himself during the whole thing. One of the bestest friends the American masses made during this, things that people really cherished. Time was duct tape, twine, string, and anything else that worked as a band-aid fix were. Making quilts from scraps of clothing that you had lying here and there wasn't just something you did because it was smart. It was again a creative outlet that people desperately needed. Lots of people don't really notice, but expressing yourself artistically and having a hobby are also things you need financial security for. It gets hard to do that when you literally can't buy the things you want to engage in those hobbies. Making quilts out of leftover scraps that just didn't have any other purpose, on the other hand, was something that helped people really connect with their imaginative side once again. Families learned to make the best out of whatever was available. Any linen that had seen better days, fabrics that were pretty much begging to be put out of their misery, all of that would get repurposed and remade into these quilts that would help a lot. It also helped to cut down the amount of work you needed to do gathering firewood and coal all the time. People would make these quilts for the long and harsh winters, and trust me, it really would get cold. It also became a bit of a cultural thing. People began to associate wearing quilts with the resilience that the public had throughout much of the Depression, and I can't really fault them for that. It is pretty hardcore. This one is probably going to surprise you the most out of everything else. People actually managed to find a lot of use for horsehair during the Depression too. Want to know how? They'd make ropes out of the stuff. Yes, actual durable ropes. Does that surprise you? Horsehair is renowned for how strong it is, and when you braid it, that only gets amplified by a ton. Ropes made out of this stuff wouldn't break or snap, and they were really an easy and natural way to make a lot of farm work more cost-effective and easy. People basically found that it was easy to kill two birds with one stone. You could do your work, and the same animals that helped you do it also helped to make it cheaper. In better times, people wouldn't go through the trouble of collecting, assembling, and then braiding all that hair together into a rope. It really was tough work, but this just goes to show how much people were hurting for cash and just quick change during the Depression. which is actually another way horsehair helped, because people from the rural areas could also come in and sell this stuff to people living in urban centers. They needed ropes too, and they often couldn't afford legitimate ones during this time. If you didn't know, it was actually common enough for people to even use the clothes that still weren't fit for any kind of furniture or clothing for insulation instead. If you didn't have that, or if you didn't have enough of it, people would instead just use straws around their homes to help keep them warm. Straw worked naturally as an insulation. Making a straw bale and constructing lots of them became a daily practice for people during the Depression, and it helped to give pretty decent insulation for how cheap it was too. Once you layer straw, it only gets warmer from there. With fabric, people could often sew it up to create makeshift blockages for any kind of draft or hole where windows and doors may be. You didn't want the cold air coming in, and lots of people had childhood blankets and clothes they never used or had no one to give them away to either. In a sense, people who lived in homes without a lot of brothers and sisters were probably better off in this regard. They didn't need to pass their clothes on to anyone, so all of the ones they couldn't use could go to this instead. Then, there was the idea of making padding with fabric and straw as well. It helped to keep homes warmer, and people would often stuff their walls with it. People would also make blankets and line the walls with them too, and little things like these piled up to make a noticeable difference in the temperature. Baking soda was really common to use as a deodorizer during the Depression. It's still something people more or less use, especially when they don't happen to have any better alternatives around. But back then, it was like the deodorizer, and nothing else would compare. It was multi-purpose and versatile. It was incredible at absorbing any kind of filthy odor and neutralizing them, and most others did a bad job because they would just mask these and wear off eventually. Baking soda, on the other hand, meant that you could actually eliminate the smells entirely and for a pretty low cost. Need to freshen the air? Sprinkle some of the stuff on your carpets, furniture, and anything else that doesn't smell quite the way God intended it to. Need to clean that fridge up? Open a can of baking soda on it and make sure your food smells just as good as the day you bought it. Those shoes violating your nose? Just a little bit of the stuff sprinkled inside will have your toes smelling like sunshine and rainbows. Don't believe me? You can try it out yourself. The stuff is innovative, and it's one of the best household hacks I've come across that really gets the job done too. You remember watching Tom and Jerry and wondering why the feathers would always come flying out of their clothes? That's something you must have seen in loads of cartoons, really. Well, it was a real concept that made it into the media, and it started during the Depression. Feathers were pretty much the go-to option for people who wanted to stuff their pillows and give them that extra day one fluff that really puts you in the mood to hit a good 13 hours of sleep. Then, it was also affordable, because instead of filling your bed up with all kinds of synthetic nonsense, you could go all natural. Feathers were cleaned and first made hygienic enough that they could work as stuffings for pillows and bedding. After that, you were good to go. The feathers could come from any kind of bird, by the way. Chickens, geese, and even ducks. Pretty much any kind of feathered animal on a farm would work for this. They even made entire feather beds out of them, and when you'd put one on a mattress or a frame, it would help give some more insulation. Combine that with straw bales, DIY quilts, and lots of fire, and you can start to imagine how people would outlast the winter. People would sometimes use the feathers for decorum too, like in hats. It was another way for people to take the edge off, since no one could really explore their love of fashion with how expensive everything had become. People would even make quill pens and write. In short, people found loads of uses for them. Like I've gone over already, people were trying their hardest to cut down the meat usage as much as possible. Wherever they could afford to spare it, they would substitute meat with something else. Mushrooms, vegetables, scraps, and any kind of grains. It became a lot more common to get your protein out of beans and dry fruits rather than protein. When people did have meat, it was either something they hunted or some obscure animal that people were really getting accustomed to eating. It became really common in the 1920s and 30s to hunt for squirrels, turtles, and just about anything else that could work as a source of protein too. Fishing was also overdone to the point that people actually drove some local populations to the edge of being wiped out. Store-bought meat was something people would try to save as much as possible since people in urban areas really couldn't raise cattle. The ones that could wanted to save theirs for as long as possible and only use them when it really counted. Overall, it became very common for people to reduce their consumption of meat as much as possible. Throughout the Depression, people really tried to thrift shop whenever they could. Besides just bartering and trading, people had all kinds of new stores that they would rely on to get them what they needed. Charity shops were one of the best places to go to. The concept of a thrift market wasn't really something that was well established throughout the Depression, but lots of charity stores were being run by churches and charities. Local businesses were also doing their best to give back to their communities and keep things okay, and they often always sold you secondhand goods. This meant that you were getting things that were slightly run down, but you were getting them for a pretty good deal. Then, surplus stores that were funded and established by the governments also helped relieve some of the woes of the public. New Deal programs and surplus goods were things you'd always find in these stores. The relief programs like the Works Progress Administration or the Federal Emergency Relief Administration were attempts to help combat the effects of the Depression. Lots of people seem to think the government could be doing a lot more, though the people that did all the groundwork in these movements really are what helped. So even kids need to find ways to pass the time and express themselves. While you'd think a time like this would mean that kids would be connecting with each other more often, since they were becoming more and more of a community, it wasn't always like that. Plus, not all families lived in areas with lots of people. In places like that, kids got to make their own toys. They'd make wooden toys out of hand-carved figures such as animals and soldiers. Lots of kids got really good at these wooden figures too, and some even got good enough to sell them and make a thing out of it to passing tourists and foreigners. The locals obviously had no money to spare for things like that. On the other hand, people would use feathers that got left over or straw they didn't need in other creative ways too. They'd make dolls and stuffed animals out of it, or even use pieces of fabric to make balls that they could play around with like dodgeball and catch. It was little things like these that restored some kind of normalcy to people's lives. People decided that it was a lot better to walk than it was to drive. No, seriously. There were all kinds of reasons to leave the car in the garage and put your running shoes on instead. Not only would you get to places for free, but it would also help a lot with your health. When people got leaner and skinnier thanks to the frugal way they were living, it helped to keep their appetites low as well. It was already something that people had learned, how to live on barely any kind of food. Walking would also really help keep your immune system's health up too, so you'd end up getting sick less often. It was time spent in the sun, so that was a free source of vitamins, something people took wherever they got. Then, there was also the fact that you'd save lots on fuel and gas. People would pretty much only take their cars out to give them some kind of usage so they wouldn't catch dust and go haywire just sitting there. But most people had really gotten into walking. Homemade bread is the last thing we're ending the list on, and it's a pretty good spot to conclude this deep dive. Homemade bread was one of the best ways for people to cut down on costs because the basic ingredients for it, like baking flour, weren't really things that were available. That's why baking your own bread at home became such a necessary skill for the people. During the Depression, it was a lot more common for people to use things like all-purpose flour and whole wheat flour whenever they could get their hands on it. Then, people would use their own kinds of yeast. This was pretty much whatever they could save up from any previous baked goods, and then water was used to activate that yeast. People would put in some salt, sugar, and a bit of fat. You'd mix and knead it with a spoon or by your own hand, and that was that. People would get instant yeast or active dry yeast, whichever helped. Flatbreads were really popular since they didn't need yeast and could even be made on open flames. That basically meant maximum cost savings since you were cutting down on your gas bill and your expenses. Cornbread was also really cheap, and it was something that was extremely available. Once you did get this bread made, you could use it in all sorts of meals. A sandwich, a soup, or even a stew and some butter. Anything would work. It's why it was such a necessary skill for people. Potato peel sandwiches were the epitome of making do and turned what most of us would toss into a surprisingly hearty meal. Stuffed between slices of bread, and if you were lucky, slathered with a bit of butter or lard, The peels were cleaned and fried in whatever grease was available. It's kind of like a rustic early version of a loaded potato skin sandwich. The crispy, slightly salty peels added a nice texture to otherwise plain bread. Sometimes onions or garlic would be thrown in for added flavor. And if you had cheese, jackpot. This humble meal was filling and resourceful, and showed you didn't have to spend much to make something comforting. Potato peel sandwiches might seem like a relic of the past, but they've quietly influenced modern cooking trends. Today, zero-waste recipes and root-to-stem cooking draw inspiration from the same resourceful spirit. Chefs now celebrate potato peels as the star of gourmet dishes, seasoning them with truffle oil or pairing them with artisanal bread. The humble sandwich, once a survival tactic, has found new life as a talking point in sustainability circles. It's fascinating how something born out of necessity can inspire culinary innovation decades later. Maybe it's time to bring them back, not out of desperation, but out of respect for their history. People didn't give up their morning buzz when coffee got too pricey, they just got creative. Chicory root, the Great Depression's favorite coffee substitute, was every house's pantry staple. This unassuming plant was dug up, roasted, and ground into a powder, becoming the secret weapon for caffeine cravings when actual coffee beans were out of the question. It wasn't a new idea. Chicory coffee had been used in Europe for years, but the Depression brought it into the American home. The root gave brews a slightly nutty, earthy flavor, and some people said it made their coffee taste richer. But others weren't so sure, saying it tasted like burnt wood. It was cheap, caffeine-free, and most importantly, available. Chicory was often harvested by families themselves, pulling roots from ditches and fields to stretch their dwindling budgets. What was once a pesky weed became a pantry essential through a little ingenuity. Chicory coffee, as it turns out, has lasted and is still a regional favorite in places like New Orleans, where it's served with beignets for a taste of Southern charm. Chicory root was a lifeline during the Great Depression, but it's now an optional indulgence. That was before fancy cafe culture. It was about finding comfort in a cup when life wasn't comfortable. In Alabama, what was native to people were things like black-eyed and field peas, which provided a lot of steady protein to the locale there for barely any money. That was the kind of food that kept people going back then, because you essentially wanted to maximize your value for money. Every cent counted more than ever before, and it was a rough time that led to a lot of people completely reworking their diets and eating habits to keep up with the times. Usually these peas would be mixed with molasses or syrup and enjoyed in do-it-yourself soups that would kind of work, but they wouldn't really taste good. Then again, as long as it was nutritious and cheap, no one could complain. Potted meat spread. The 1930s tin can be savior. You're absolutely right if you're imagining mystery meat mashed into a paste. However, let's face it, that little tin of potted meat was the hero of many Depression-era meals. This questionable concoction was spread on crackers or smeared between slices of stale bread and kept families fed when other protein sources were out of reach. Potted meat spread was made from finely ground scraps of pork or beef, seasoned with salt, spices, and sometimes gelatin, and had a long shelf life and a low price tag. Others got creative, adding it to onions or pickles to add some flavor. Some were not so lucky and ate it straight from the can. And let's not forget the genius marketing. Even if potted meat wasn't exactly a gourmet experience, it was often marketed as the ultimate protein-packed snack for families on the go. During a time when home-cooked meals were often replaced by anything that could be prepared quickly, it was cheap, filling, and in its own way, a miracle worker. Was it delicious? Probably not. It was practical, portable, and didn't need cooking. A major bonus when every penny counted. Potted meat spread still lives on in grocery aisles as a throwback to those hard times. You won't see it on the center of a modern charcuterie board, but it's a reminder of survival, ingenuity, and the pure will to make something edible out of almost nothing. The magic of salt pork was always something you could count on during the Great Depression. This heavily salted slab of fatty meat was a lifeline for families trying to stretch meals to infinity and beyond. Refrigeration was a luxury for many, and salt pork's long shelf life made it an indispensable pantry item. Salt pork wasn't just a food, It was an ingredient, a seasoning, and sometimes a main course. It flavored beans, greens, and soups, enough to give even the simplest dishes a little indulgence. When we were leaner, we'd fry up a small piece of salt pork and use the rendered fat to cook everything else. The result? A meal that had the feel of more meat than it actually had. However, it wasn't all plain sailing. The salt pork was so salty that it often had to be soaked or boiled before eating. It was affordable, versatile, and practically indestructible, a trifecta of survival during tough times. Salt pork is much more likely to appear in gourmet kitchens than in emergency pantries today. But back then, it was a salty superhero, rescuing countless Depression-era meals from bland oblivion. Alaska, on the other hand, was luckier. They had the privilege of being next to bodies of water, so they could actually catch their food hunter-gatherer style and essentially eat for free. Subsistence living became the normal lifestyle that people incorporated into their weekly routines, and one of the best ways to sustain an entire family and take advantage of the bounty of nature was fish and game stews. Any kind of stew would work. It wouldn't really be a proper recipe, and a lot of the time it would just be using whatever hands-on ingredients they could come up with. But hey, it filled everyone's bowl. Sometimes dinner was just onions, water, and a dream. Depression-era classic born of pure necessity, onion gravy on bread. Onions were the next best thing to flavor whatever scraps you had or didn't have when meat was scarce. The result? A simple, savory meal that was surprisingly satisfying given its humble beginnings. Frying onions in a bit of lard or butter, if you were lucky, then simmering them in water and thickening the mixture with flour was the way the gravy was made. Voila! Pour this over a slice of bread, and dinner was served. Interestingly, onion gravy on bread became such a staple that it wasn't just limited to supper. It sometimes served as a breakfast or lunch, depending on what was available. The beauty of the dish was its ability to stretch the little food that people had into a comforting meal. And while the dish might not have earned high culinary acclaim back in the day, it was a true testament to the resourcefulness and resilience of families during the Great Depression. Even if the bread was stale, the gravy would soften it right up. It wasn't just about feeding an entire family, it was about stretching a single onion. Today, we may not think onion gravy on bread is much of a culinary wonder, but back then it was a lifeline. There's something charmingly rustic about the dish, believe it or not, and it's even made its way into the gourmet circles under fancier names like onion tartines. It wasn't a foodie trend for those who lived through the Great Depression. It was a tribute to creativity in the face of hardship. Hominy was a humble kitchen staple during the Great Depression, and it stretched far and wide. Hominy puffed up into soft, chewy nuggets made by soaking dried corn kernels in lye. Yes, lye, and as versatile as they were filling. Hominy may not have been glamorous, but it did the job. Hominy made its way into soups, casseroles, and even as a side dish fried. A texture party, it gave simple meals a satisfying chew. It became the base for Southern favorites like grits for those who could afford a little extra seasoning. It was a hearty, starchy savior on lean days for everyone else. Hominy was often prepared in large batches, which they dried and stored for future use. This wasn't just food, it was an investment for the long term, so you wouldn't go hungry. Making hominy wasn't exactly convenient, but it was worth it when food supplies were low. Hominy is still a staple in some cuisines, but it's long since faded from everyday American tables. But for those who lived through the Great Depression, this unassuming corn product was a lifeline. And once again, necessity is the mother of culinary invention. People living in Arizona were pretty much eating very similarly to how people in Alabama were living. They had beans instead of peas and chili instead of molasses. But chili beans were something that people would eat even in regular times when the economy hadn't caved in on itself. So in that regard, they got off pretty lucky. I know that sounds like an exaggeration, but I'm really not kidding. It was a luxury to even have food, but to be able to enjoy it too made you one of the really lucky ones during the Depression. Chili beans, thanks to Mexican influences, let locals live another day. Is this the most metal dinner of the Great Depression? Boiled sheep's head, a meal so intense it had its own built-in stare-down. Folks did indeed boil an entire sheep's head. And no, this is not just urban legend. The head was thoroughly cleaned, seasoned, and simmered for hours until tender. The result? A dish rich in fat, where no part of the animal was wasted. The broth, cheeks, tongue, and eyeballs were all considered delicacies. Good liquid gold for soups or stews. Why eat sheep's head? When money was tight, every scrap of protein was important, and the head had a surprising amount of meat. The families gathered around the table, picking it clean and making the best of what they had. Boiled sheep's head might sound horrifying to modern sensibilities, but for those who could turn something unappealing into a meal worth savoring, it was a source of pride. It was also a lesson in sustainability long before sustainability became a trendy thing. These days, it's a rare dish, but in some cultures, it's a culinary tradition that lives on. Hardtack, also known as the cracker that could survive the apocalypse, was a Depression-era favorite for those wanting to stockpile something that wouldn't spoil. It was a rock-hard biscuit made of nothing but flour, water, maybe a pinch of salt. Nothing special, but dependable. Hardtack was a legacy food, one with military rations and sailor diets pedigree. It was a Depression-era hit because families could stash it in pantries without fear of spoilage. Plain, it was like gnawing on a brick. It was almost edible, but softened with soup, milk, or coffee, it became almost edible. Emphasis on almost. Hardtack was bland, but there was something charming about it. It was cheap, easy to make, and incredibly filling. It was the base for many families' meals when ingredients were scarce. It thickened stews, broken into crumbs, or was an impromptu plate when real dishware wasn't an option, left whole. Today, hardtack is more of a historical curiosity than a pantry must-have. However, during the Great Depression, this humble cracker represented resilience. It wasn't fancy or flavorful, but it kept people going when times were tough, and that's what mattered. One of the things you'll often hear your grandparents repeating like a broken record or a parrot is the importance of corn in your diet, and how you really need to eat your greens and your corn. Well, it's not for nothing. Cut them some slack and just lend an ear the next time you hear it, because in Arkansas, and in a majority of other states too, fried cornbread and greens were the daily lunch and breakfast of many families. Cornbread in general was ridiculously cheap and easy to get, and it was common for people to barter with it or for it too, so it definitely got a lot of mileage in Arkansas, thanks to them always having a knack for growing corn. Kraut juice. It's just what it sounds like. During the Great Depression, fermented cabbage brine was a go-to pantry item, prized for its versatility and surprising nutritional benefits. It was a byproduct of sauerkraut making, and wasting it was out of the question. Straight down the throat for its purported health benefits as a cooking liquid for soups and stews, or even as a splash to bland foods to add flavor. Basically, it was the Depression-era version of an electrolyte drink, thought to help digestion and keep people going when fresh produce was scarce. But the taste was divisive. You either loved it or learned to tolerate it. Kraut juice had its good points too. It was cheap, it kept forever, and it was surprisingly rich in vitamins and probiotics. It was a lifeline in a jar for families with limited resources. Kraut juice has faded from the household staple, but it hasn't gone away altogether. Some old-school recipes still use it, and occasionally it's sipped as a health tonic. For the people who lived through the Great Depression, kraut juice wasn't a health trend. It was a necessity. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked, one briny sip at a time. California also had the benefit of having some good and fertile soil, which is what helped it last out the economic drought with relatively everything still as it was, besides the obvious damages that everyone suffered. Some states were hit a lot worse than others, but California had government surpluses going for it and a rich history of agricultural practices, so they always had greens like cabbage and lettuces in plenty. Cabbage soup was a pretty popular pick there, especially if they had any kind of cheap bread to go with it. If the idea of cow brain stew makes you squirm, just think about eating it because you had no other choice. Even during the Great Depression, even cow brains were fair game in the fight against hunger. Surprisingly, they weren't just edible. In some circles, they were considered a delicacy. The process of making cow brain stew was meticulous. Brains had to be carefully cleaned to remove any membranes and then gently cooked to avoid an overly rubbery texture. Once seasoned and simmered, the resulting stew had a smooth, creamy consistency that was somewhat comforting. It was silky, almost custard-like, and possibly that's why some people actually liked it. The brain was usually served over rice or potatoes and made one brain into a meal for a family. Cow brain was nutritionally a powerhouse of protein and vitamins and was a valuable food source in lean times. The idea of eating brains didn't exactly have much popularity, and as soon as more appealing options were offered, cow brain stew fell out of favor. Interestingly, in some cultures, eating brain meat was considered a delicacy long before the Depression. For example, certain European and Asian dishes have celebrated cow brains as a prized food item. But as food options became more plentiful and tastes evolved, cow brain stew faded into the background, becoming a curious relic of a time when necessity ruled the dinner plate. These days, cow brain stew is more likely to be a dare than a dinner table. Back then, it was a lifesaver, proving that humans can eat anything, even when the going gets tough. Cornbread was also used as a substitute for the typical ingredients you would use for a pancake. And speaking of vegetables, one of the most reliable ones in the Depression for the country as a whole were potatoes. You can kind of see where I'm going with this, can't you? You've probably been around the block with potato pancakes more than a few times in your lifetime, but unless you're from Colorado, you wouldn't know about how the state has a natural tendency for potato farming. That's why any kind of dish that was made out of them was widely popular there, but especially pancakes, because it restored some sense of normalcy in a time that was drastically changing day by day. I never knew fat could be the unsung hero of the Great Depression. Sweet, the solid white fat from the loins or kidneys of sheep and cows, was much more than a pantry staple. It was a survival tool. Sweat was once prized for its versatility, being used in cooking, baking, and even non-food uses such as making candles and soap. When resources were scarce and people had to make the most of every morsel, it was the original all-in-one solution. Sweat was a game-changer in the kitchen. It gave the dishes of meat pies, puddings, and dumplings richness, which helped to make them hearty enough to stretch a meal for an entire family. During the colder months, when energy reserves were important, its high-calorie content made it essential. Suet wasn't just for savory dishes either, with recipes like suet pudding turning this otherwise savory staple into a sweet one. In addition to its utility, suet was available. It was often considered a byproduct by butchers and sold cheaply, so even the most cash-strapped families could afford it. It was also easy to render and store and kept for months when properly handled. Suet has pretty much disappeared from modern kitchens, but it occasionally makes an appearance in traditional recipes. It was more than just fat to those who lived through the Great Depression. It was a lifeline in lard's clothing. Prune pudding is evidence that even in hard times, people still wanted a sweet ending to their meal. Fresh fruit was rare during the Great Depression, and prunes, with their long shelf life and natural sweetness, were the unsung heroes of dessert. They weren't glamorous, but they did the job. This was a humble pudding, stewed down to a thick, syrupy base. Prunes were often sweetened with sugar and spiced with cinnamon or nutmeg to improve the flavor. A few cooks even added milk, breadcrumbs, or a touch of lemon juice to brighten the dish. But if you were lucky, it might be topped with a dollop of whipped cream. But that was a luxury. Real quick, if you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. Prune pudding was surprisingly nutritionally rich for its simplicity. It wasn't just a treat, it was practical sustenance packed with fiber and vitamins. But its reputation as a digestive aid made it a divisive dessert. It wasn't everyone's idea of a sweet indulgence, to put it mildly. Prune pudding has faded into the background today, often overshadowed by more flashy desserts. In a world fixated on superfoods and functional eating, maybe it's time for this Depression-era favorite to come back. But don't expect it to replace chocolate cake anytime soon. When the Great Depression hit, sorghum syrup ruled the roost as the king of sweeteners. Honey maple syrup be damned. This thick, golden brown liquid was made by boiling down the juice of sorghum cane, and it was a lifeline for families trying to sweeten their lives without breaking the bank. It was affordable and versatile enough to earn a permanent place in Depression-era pantries. Sorghum syrup was not just a sweetener. It was a source of vital nutrients such as iron, calcium, and magnesium. It wasn't just tasty, it was functional, in an era when balanced meals were often a luxury. Sorghum on a biscuit, cornbread, or oatmeal could make a meager breakfast something special. It even made its way into sauces, marinades, baked goods, and even into ice cream. Sorghum syrup production was a community affair. During harvest time, people gathered in entire neighborhoods to crush sorghum stalks and boil the juice into syrup. It was labor-intensive, but it was also social, and it forged bonds even in the darkest of times. Back then, it wasn't about foodie trends, but today, sorghum syrup is experiencing a small renaissance in the culinary world. It was about survival, resourcefulness, and getting as much goodness as we could out of the land. Sorghum syrup wasn't just a treat for Depression-era families. It was a symbol of sweetness that endured in hard times. Delaware also had to make do with what scraps it could get. People from there were passing day by day on peas and soups, so the two would eventually cross over. It was natural for pea soup to become as common as it did in Delaware. It was a way to keep hydrated, get protein, and get some carbs too, depending on the kind of peas that were available. Making soups out of anything you could was kind of just the thing to do back then. It was a really common practice that a lot of Americans started adopting because of how convenient and easy to make they were. What if you opened a can and slid out an entire chicken, gelatinous and glistening in all its preserved glory? Isn't that the stuff of a culinary horror story? But the canned whole chicken was a practical miracle for struggling Depression families. It was exactly what it sounded like, an oddity. A fully cooked chicken stuffed into a tin, bones and all, sitting in a salty broth that turned to gelatin when chilled. No one could afford to be picky in the 1930s, but the sight of it wobbling onto a plate might have been enough to make someone lose their appetite. The process of making canned whole chicken was fascinating. First, the chicken would be fully cooked and then packed into a tin with broth. After the can was sealed, the gelatin formed as the contents cooled, helping to preserve the meat and provide a long shelf life. While it didn't have the tender, fresh flavor of a roast chicken, it was a surprisingly adaptable ingredient. Heated whole or shredded into soups, casseroles, or sandwiches, the chicken was a versatile, cost-effective protein source. Taste-wise, it wasn't winning any Michelin stars, but it did what it needed to do: keep families fed. It wasn't fresh, but the salty flavor covered that up, and when combined with gravy or spices, it was surprisingly tasty. Canned chicken still exists, but the whole chicken in a can is a thing of the past. It's a sign of how far food preservation has come and a reminder of what desperate times can do. The canned whole chicken is gone, but those who lived through its heyday have not forgotten it. Pickled vegetables were the ultimate solution for long-term nourishment when fresh produce was a fleeting luxury. Families in the Great Depression knew how to make their gardens work overtime, and pickling was a go-to way to stretch the harvest into lean winter months. If it grew, it could be pickled. Cucumbers, green beans, cabbage, and even watermelon rinds were preserved in tangy brine. The process was simple but ingenious. Jars were packed with vegetables, vinegar, salt, and spices to become shelf-stable pantry stars. Preserving food with pickling didn't just preserve the food, it elevated it. Pickled vegetables gave sharp, zesty flavors to otherwise bland meals, bringing a taste of summer to the dead of winter. Pickling was more than a food preservation method. It was a communal activity. Neighbors swapped jars, families shared brine recipes, and pickling became a way to connect during hard times. Nothing was wasted. Even scraps that would have otherwise been discarded had a second life in the pickle jar. Real quick, If you're loving this content as much as we loved making it, hit subscribe to stay connected and help us reach even more amazing folks like you. Pickled vegetables are a trendy addition to charcuterie boards these days, but during the Depression, they were a necessity. But for families who were barely making ends meet, a pantry full of jars of pickled vegetables wasn't just a source of food, it was a source of pride and security. Southern states like Florida thrived off of everyday staples like grits, cornbread, and fish, since it was also one of the coastal states that relied on fishing to get their money. It was a skill that really came in handy during the Depression, knowing how to fish, probably more than it had ever mattered before those times had come knocking. People went from eating deli meats and foods, wraps and bacon every day, to making do with grits and fish, which was a lucky day for most in Florida as far as they were concerned. Surprise spice cake is a prime example of how Depression-era cooks knew how to turn a lack of ingredients into a culinary triumph. No eggs, butter, or milk? No problem. This cake was made with pantry staples and a little ingenuity, and turned out moist, flavorful, and most importantly, budget-friendly. Often, the surprise was in its unexpected ingredients. Some of the versions used mayonnaise in place of eggs and oil, vinegar, or even tomato soup to add moisture. The warm spices, cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves, did double duty to cover odd flavors and provide the cake with its signature aroma. If they had raisins, nuts, or applesauce on hand, they threw those in, and each version was different. The surprise spice cake was a hit at potlucks and family gatherings because it didn't taste like a compromise. It was rich and comforting and proof that you didn't have to use fancy ingredients to make something special. This cake has fallen out of favor, but some of its descendants, like mayonnaise cake, still turn up in recipe books. It's a sweet reminder that even in the toughest of times, people find ways to treat themselves and one another. The best desserts sometimes come from thinking outside the box, or in this case, the pantry. Evaporated apples came to the rescue when the orchard was empty and fresh fruit was a distant memory. These dried slices were a Depression-era treasure, lightweight, shelf-stable, and could take a plain dish and make it special. During the cold months, fresh produce was scarce, and a jar of evaporated apples was worth its weight in gold. Evaporated apples could be rehydrated in water and turned into pies, crisps, or cobblers, bringing the essence of autumn to winter tables. In addition, they were also a sweet addition to oatmeal, pancakes, or even savory stews. Evaporated apples were different from canned fruits. They didn't need sugar or preservatives and were an affordable and natural choice for frugal families. The resourcefulness of the drying process itself was a testimony. Apples were often sliced thinly, and families would place them out in the sun or hang them on strings to air dry. Even bumper crops didn't go to waste with this low-tech method. The flesh and the core of every apple were used. Dried apples are today a popular snack, but during the Great Depression, they were a symbol of ingenuity. Georgia had Hoppin' Johns, which was a piece of culture that was taken from the Gullah people, an African-American tribe that had a long-established presence in the state. Their cooking methods relied a lot on natural, organic food. Fruits, peas, beans, stuff like that. That's why there was such an interest from the broader community into how they cooked things, because they wanted to know how to make the best use of ingredients like that too. Luckily, the Hoppin' John recipe spread enough that it became a household name. It was really just rice and peas, but it was homely and cozy, feelings that you just could not get during the Depression. Lamb's lung and lights may not have been the best thing to don't knock it till you try it, but it was a Depression-era staple nonetheless. The lungs, heart, and liver of a lamb, or in other words, everything the butcher left behind after he took the prime cuts. During hard times, nothing went to waste, not even the parts of the animal most people wouldn't dream of eating today. Boiled and sliced, lamb's lung and lights were sometimes prepared for a hearty stew or fried with onions and spices to hide the gamey flavor. It was nutritionally dense, with iron, protein, and essential vitamins in abundance. The downside? Cooking with the smell was an acquired experience, to put it mildly. This dish had an unappealing reputation, but it was versatile. With potatoes or bread, The organs could stretch to feed large families. It was an act of culinary ingenuity, and while it might sound like something straight out of a horror movie to modern palates, it was an act of culinary ingenuity. Lamb's lung and lights have vanished from most dinner tables, but if you're curious, you might still see it on some adventurous menus or in a distant family recipe book, written in faded ink and a generous dose of nostalgia. And that is all the brilliant ways people in the Great Depression saved money. Which trick stood out to you the most? Comment down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.